In the run-up to the next round of actions by Extinction Rebellion, we look at the plan put forward by their key spokesperson Rupert Read that children should be specifically put into the front line because if they can get children arrested, it will make a lot of people more sympathetic to their cause. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemen. Later this week, it is planned that there will be some actions involving drones at London Heathrow. We'll talk about that specifically later. Then early next month, it will be time for the next full-scale Extinction Rebellion extended actions in London. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I am a critic of the tactics of Extinction Rebellion, which are to radicalise young people by overclaiming that the science means that they're not going to live to grow old, and thereby persuade them to get involved with breaking the law, inspired by a core organising group that said it's their aim to bring down the government. My basic position is this is not what you do if you are serious about taking action on climate change. But there's one area specifically where I think the approach of XR strays from the area of misguided into one of plain wicked. Here are the words of one of their central figures, Rupert Read, writing in a document originally intended for internal discussion but latterly published for a wider audience. Imagine an October with tens of thousands of children and students on the streets of London engaging in NVDA, non-violent direct action, breaking the law in other words. That is how a crucial stage in the civil rights movement was won in Birmingham, Alabama, with over 1,000 minors in the prison cells. It was a step not taken at all lightly by the civil rights leadership, but it worked. It could work here too. Our rebellion must seek to reach out and involve people of all ages, and especially those children. When there are arrests and imprisonments of children alongside adults, the game will have changed and the authorities will be placed in a dilemma. Whatever action they take will look very bad. Evil, despicable, Rupert Read, leave the children alone. The use of children may not have been taken lightly by the civil rights movement in the US, but it's certainly seen as a point of first resort by Extinction Rebellion. Almost from day one, they've been putting young children on their platforms, which I've covered elsewhere. And now, having told these children they're going to die young, they're then going to utilise the fear that they themselves have created by getting those children to undertake actions that may very well have huge life consequences for them. All because it may confer a tactical advantage. It's not needed, it's not compassionate, it is not moral. Being concerned for the future being left for young people is something that might motivate the actions of adults. It doesn't justify using those people as pawns. Let me repeat what I've said before. These children you want to get arrested. Can they consent to sex? No, they can't. Even if they say yes to someone, they are held to be too immature to be able to take that sort of decision because they can't have a realistic view of the consequences. Are they allowed to vote? No, because they're not yet held to have the maturity to be able to evaluate the sorts of issues and dynamics involved with the governance of the country. Are they allowed to drive? No, because they're not considered to be mature enough to be safe drivers in charge of a vehicle that can have major consequences for people around them. But as far as Rupert Read is concerned, they are nevertheless old enough to ruin their lives by getting themselves arrested. Great job, Rupert. What an outstanding citizen you are. It's not that he hides his pitch. He has a video on YouTube right now titled How I Talk with Children About Climate Breakdown. It's the same talk basically as the one I fact-checked in another video here, the one that starts with the all adults have failed you and I fear for you as a result. Here's Rupert talking to young children.
You are in a terrible predicament. It's worse than you've been told, almost certainly, probably a lot worse. Dangerous climate change and the extinction crisis, the crisis of many, many species going extinct as we speak, if they're not stopped, will mean that you do not have normal lives like your parents have. This is about whether you have a future. People probably sometimes ask you, what are you going to be when you grow up? But we've reached a point in human history where the question also has to be asked, what are you going to do if you grow up?
Seriously, somebody keep this man away from children. What he doesn't mention is how he's failing them today by seeking to manipulate them into actions that may be damaging to them in the future. That he's casually giving them nightmares that will keep them awake at night. Because actually, he doesn't care about them. He just cares about what they can do for the movement. Now, of course, what he says and what his defenders would say is that he's just telling the kids the truth because it's time they were told the hard facts. He reminds me of a person I heard about whose father encouraged them as a child to jump off a table so he would catch them. And they jumped and he didn't catch them. And through his tears, he said, "There's a lesson for you, son. Don't trust anyone." Nobody who hears that story thinks anything but that that father is a scumbag who shouldn't be allowed to breed. Even those who might be inclined to agree with the cynical message think that. And that's how I think about what Rupert Read does in that video. I mean, as we saw in the fact-checking video, he's wrong about his message, at least as far as the verified science is concerned. But even if he wasn't, that approach is the scumbag move, not the responsible adult move. The similarity here with fanatical movements is not entirely a mirage, even though the movement as a whole, Extinction Rebellion, isn't fanatical, the ordinary people who join the protest. In fact, Read's document overall is a work of someone completely out of touch with reality. He refers to the government's commitment to net zero carbon by 2050. Bear in mind this was written before the recent change in Prime Minister. In talking about how wonderfully successful XR's previous action was, he says, "Incredibly, Theresa May has legislated for a carbon net zero target. There was simply no chance that this would have happened as little as 3 months ago." He adds, "We did this." That's right, Rupert, all down to you. The fact that there was a detailed technical process behind the Committee on Climate Change's report that had been a year in the drafting, well, that has nothing to do with it. 1 minute they were sitting around on their hands thinking about, I don't know, money or maybe Love Island, and the next they'd be shocked into action by seeing you gluing your hands to the Shell headquarters. And you know what? Fine, let's suppose you're right. Let's ride that particular rainbow farting unicorn for just a moment. Clearly then, you don't need to put children at risk by putting them in the front line, because what you're doing already is working so well, right? I mean, if you cared a damn about the kids, you wouldn't do it by first preference, would you? Not only is this just a despicable piece of politicking, but it's also completely counterproductive from a campaign perspective. Later this week, if the XR splinter group Heathrow Paws have their way, there will be drones at Heathrow. If their action is successful, it will result in a massive wave of counterproductive publicity and condemnation that will damage the movement to promote action on climate change. My expectation, and we only have a few days before we know if my prediction's hopelessly wide of the mark or not, is that if it's attempted, the police action will be so swift and thorough, maybe preemptive, to defuse it very quickly. I think the campaigners who say that they know that the penalties will be stiffer for this sort of action, they're nevertheless completely underestimating the scale of the response of the police and overestimating their ability to disrupt. We will see. But even if I'm right, there will be negative publicity, as there has been already on this initiative. And of course, campaigners will then moan about the media attacking them and people criticising them, suggesting this is what they have to contend with. But no, you are creating that backlash unnecessarily by doing strategically idiotic things. And if you then follow it up with a couple of weeks of disruption in London, where you actively try to get children arrested, in what deranged mind does this become a positive asset for the movement on climate change? At what point do you think the public begins to see a shift from children having been inspired to take action themselves with the school strikes inspired by Greta Thunberg, to one of disreputable adults manipulating children against their interests? Now, I understand that everyone's become fairly tribal about this and they don't want to acknowledge flaws in their own side. But if you're involved in Extinction Rebellion and you want that to be something that's positive and not negative in terms of its impact, then for goodness sake, ask some hard questions. about what is the strategy for involvement of children. Now, I don't know, maybe Rupert Read failed to persuade people of his argument internally, and I hope so. But his position has been shadowed by founder Roger Hallam, and his pamphlet and his presentation to children has been promoted by Extinction Rebellion, and the group fields Read as one of its main spokespeople to many of the events that he gets invited to. So it does seem to me as though nobody sees much of a problem in what he's proposing. By the way, what usually happens with these videos is that I get a bunch of comments from XR supporters saying things like, "You may have a point, but it's a crisis." As if doing dumb things that exploit children and lose you support make more sense to do in a crisis than any other time. After all, when the Titanic was going down, it was a case of protecting the women and children first. They didn't say, let's stitch the children together into a life raft because they're probably more buoyant than the adults. There's a lot we have to do on climate change. The first thing would be to acknowledge that a lot of people are indeed already working on this and have been for some time, and that some real progress is being made. And to acknowledge that we have reached the time when we need to debate and decide on the concrete actions we're going to take. Want to know what they might be? Take a look at the technical report of the Committee on Climate Change. They're in there, with a timeline, a lot of detail about why and how. And for sure, maybe there are some better ideas. Now's the time to discuss. Extinction Rebellion has nothing to contribute to that discussion. It's not interested in solutions. Its core organising group just wants the power taken away from the democratic government and put in the hands of people who say they'll hold a glorified focus group to come up with ideas. It's just a low-quality proposition. Why would anyone embrace that as the best option on the table? Why don't people begin to ask themselves why, if it's such a crisis, wouldn't you begin to engage with the practical actions that people and businesses and lots of others are already taking, and the propositions for what would make the best difference next? Any idiot can wave a banner and demand somebody do some unspecified thing because it's an emergency. The question is, do adults step into the debate and take responsibility by engaging in a serious way of what those actions should be? Or do the adults instead manipulate children into taking the lead because it's ultimately about winning a fight against government and the police and not about climate change at all?